Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me this week is Chris Parrington, founder of Cannapliant Consulting and general counsel of Boustead Securities. Thank you very much for joining me today, Chris.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Chris, I always like to start the podcast with a little bit of background. And I'm curious because with your background, what was it that brought you to the cannabis industry?
David, that's a great question, and I get it all the time. So, I'm an attorney by trade. I've been practicing for over 20 years, actually 21 years coming up here shortly, but 20 years in private practice. And the bulk of my practice was in financial services, the securities industry. So representing investment banking firms, representing investment advisory firms, on a whole wide range of things, whether it was, litigation, whether it was regulatory compliance. As you advance in that type of a practice, you start out really kind of in the courtroom fighting disputes, and then you learn enough that you can advise your clients on how to avoid the courtroom and avoid those disputes. And so it's really more of a focus on compliance. Well, I had a broker-dealer firm out of Kansas that I was representing, and their director of supervision, big national firm, they did, everything you could think of. And they reached out to me, their director of supervisor reached out to me. It was February of 2014. And I only remember that because that was when all the guidance memos really started to heat up. And they said, Chris, we've got an issue we don't know the answer to. And I said, well, fire away. And the question was, they had a branch office in Denver, Colorado. They had a registered rep who worked in that branch, who had a friend who wanted to open up an account at the firm. They wanted to invest their money in traditional mutual funds. And I said, okay, I'm not following along. What's the problem here? And he said, well, he showed up with $300,000 in cash. Instantly, my radar went up because, once you get over $10,000 in cash in financial services, it creates some red flags and some alarms. And so I just assumed that was the question that they had. So I asked him that, and he said, well, it's not that simple. That $300,000 in cash he made growing and selling marijuana legally under Colorado law. That was my first exposure to the cannabis industry. And really at that time, the question was, what do we do? Can we take the cash? Can we open up the account and can we invest in traditional mutual funds, or can we do something, or should we do something else? Well, where we were 10 years ago to where we are today is a whole drastic difference. The evolution of cannabis banking, cannabis financing, it's phenomenal what's happened in 10 years. So back then the answer was, don't take it, don't touch it. It's not worth the risk. The FinCEN guidance had just come out. If I recall, the second Cole memo had just come out. And so it was a very simple answer back then. But I really became passionate at that point and interested in what really was a novel idea, a novel concept, an opportunity to be at the forefront of an industry and a forefront of a legal industry that, last one that existed was probably the employment law, movement back in the 50s and 60s that, our parents and grandparents were part of. And so I started looking at it, and I started looking into it from a legal perspective, from a compliance perspective, and I started talking to lawyers that were holding themselves out as experts in this space, whether it was, California, Washington, Colorado. And what I started to realize was the majority of the lawyers that were in this space that were advising people were old criminal defense lawyers, and they had made a living defending guys as they were getting caught with the product. So they're defending manufacturing with intent to sell, possession of drug paraphernalia, whether it's consumption paraphernalia, whether it's manufacturing equipment, you name it. And they realized, hey, now it's legal. Now there's an opportunity for me to be a business lawyer, for me to start being on the business side of it, especially in states in California that were so open to, prior convictions and putting people on licenses like, Oakland, where I think they mandated 50% of the licenses had to be for people with convictions. And so I realized that was my competition if I wanted to get in this space. But what was even more important was I started asking these people, how do you handle compliance? How do you deal with compliance in this industry? And the answer was almost consistently the same, which was, well, I tell my clients how to stay out of federal prison. Well, that's a whole, I tell people that's this end of the spectrum for compliance. There's another end on here, and there's everything in between. And so I really just started researching, started writing, started learning the industry, and eventually it grew. I started because of my financial institutions background. And at the time, I was at a large national firm, 550 lawyers based out of Omaha, Nebraska, so very conservative. And they let me do this work, but they only let me do this work for ancillary service providers, product providers. So anybody plant touching, we're not willing to take on that risk quite now. And so I started working with companies. For example, I worked with a company based out of Lincoln, Nebraska, that manufactured farming equipment. And they realized that some of the equipment that they make could be used for cultivating marijuana. And they wanted to start marketing that in the state of Colorado. Well, one of the employees filed a whistleblowing complaint with management and said, well, wait a minute, it's illegal in Nebraska, so I can't do this type of work. And I think we shouldn't be doing this type of work. And so I got hired to research, investigate, advise on those types of things. And then over the course of probably 2 to 3 years, I went from, all right, I can work with manufacturers of equipment. I can work with investment banking firms. I can work with people that are, the third party ancillary product and service providers to, all right, now I can start working with medical people. The firm understands that I know what I'm talking about. I can start working with medical licensees. Now I can start working with adult use licensees. And by the end of it, when I left the firm about 2 years ago, we had probably 25 lawyers that were touching the cannabis industry, and I'd say 20 to 25% of their daily work. There was almost 0% when I started there. And we built this kind of nice big practice, really providing the cannabis industry with access to the same legal services every other industry gets, but for a variety of different reasons, were just not available at the time.
Did you wind up letting that company sell the equipment to Colorado?
Well, so they made a business decision not to do it. Okay. And part of it was because of Nebraska's attitude towards cannabis at the time. And they didn't want to get on the radars in Nebraska. And in fact, it's funny, I got to see that evolution because early on, I was kind of hidden. I was the stepchild that they locked in the closet of the firm, and nobody really talked about what I did. And then the funny part, and I'll show you this, I was asked about 3 years later to come speak at the Nebraska Bankers Association on cannabis banking. And the head president of the Bankers Association gave me this pin to wear at everything moving forward. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, 2 years ago, I wasn't even allowed to exist. And now here I am getting, a cannabis leaf pin from them. So to answer the question, though, no, they made the decision not to do it. But if they were going to do it, we did have conversations about, how do you protect yourselves? How do you really, avoid being, accused of violating federal drug paraphernalia laws? So
were you pretty much the only person in town doing actual, business law? I mean, I see you out there in a landscape with other criminal defense lawyers, and I feel like you're just kind of a one-man army out there.
To an extent, yes. So, what I found was within the firm I was at the time, and I think it was pretty representative of the legal industry nationally, you had a lot of people that had niche practices. So, okay, I'm a corporate finance guy. I can help draft, private placement memorandums or offering docs to raise capital. And, oh, by the way, here's a company that happens to be in the cannabis space that needs my services. So I'll do that. I'll work on that project for them. Or I'm a corporate lawyer. I'm an employment lawyer. And I come across, a situation that involves the cannabis industry, kind of a one-off project. And what I realized was, you hear the saying all the time, it's cannabis or that's cannabis. It's a crazy industry. And part of it is because it comes from an illegal industry. You have a lot of very senior, very sophisticated, very knowledgeable, and very experienced players that are used to not operating like a real traditional business. And in fact, they probably are advised by people not to operate like a traditional business. And I'll give a great example of that. I did a due diligence trip in San Francisco. I represented at the time a private equity fund that was going to buy a licensee. And I'm sitting in the guy's office. We're down on market and I'm talking to him. I'm looking at his plants and I'm looking at his operation and everything's going great. And I said to him, all right, I need to see your financials. Next step is I need to see your financials. And he said, I don't have them. And now, remind you, this is 9 years ago. He said, I don't have them. I said, well, if you don't have, one, why don't you have them? He said, well, My lawyer told me better to ask for forgiveness from the IRS for not having proper financials than give the roadmap of where the money's going for prosecution. And I said, well, how do you know how you're doing? He said, it's very simple. I've got $3.5 million in cash as we sit here today. I said, again, how do you know that? Every floorboard you're sitting on right now can hold $1 million. They're 3.5 full. And you open one of them up with $1 million cash in it. And that was financing at the time. And that was kind of how that operated. And so, what I really focused on, and I said this earlier, was how can we give the industry access to the legal services that the rest of the world has, but we don't have. And what I found is one of the easiest ways to do that is have somebody like me who understands the industry, knows the players, and knows how to talk the talk and walk the walk. And the best way to do that is from a compliance perspective, in my opinion. And so a lot of times there were things that I could do on my own, but most of the time I was really serving as the liaison, or if you want to call it the interpreter, between the cannabis industry and the rest of the legal industry. And then over the course of time, I learned a lot of stuff, learned how to do things that weren't necessarily in my traditional basket. And then found myself really kind of sitting in the shoes of a general practitioner, in the cannabis industry, but really still continuing that focus on compliance.
So 9 years ago, you're pulling cash out of floorboards. How, in your opinion, has the industry matured? And, has it paced in a way that you expected, or are we more ahead or behind than you would expect the industry to be in 10 years?
That's a great question, actually. Where are we compared to where we think we are? I'm going to say that we're both ahead and behind. I think we could be a lot further ahead. Unfortunately, because it's a state-by-state industry, every state does things a little different. Unfortunately, what I've started to see and what I've observed, including in my home state of Minnesota, is rather than learn from the bad that the prior states did and make that better, we somehow take the bad and make it worse and go the wrong direction. So from a regulatory perspective, I think that we are behind. I feel like, and I don't know if that's arrogance of legislators, arrogance of government agencies saying, I want to do it my way. I'm not going to listen to anybody else. Maybe it's the result of, an attempt at creativity, and unfortunately, it just doesn't go the right direction. But from a regulatory perspective, I think we're behind. From access to additional services, I think we're further along than I thought we would have been. Cannabis accounting is it's there. The big firms are doing it. The mid-sized firms are doing it. The small firms are doing it. Cannabis law, I'm now a dime a dozen as far as I'm concerned. And I think 10 years ago, I was one of the only people. I can tell you in my home state, Minnesota, I was the only person that did this. And in fact, it used to drive my wife nuts because we'd show, and I ran this experiment. We'd go to a kids hockey game, or we'd go to a cocktail party, and people would say, "Oh, hey, what do you do for a living?" "I'm a lawyer." Okay, I'd lose them right away. Then somebody said, "Well, what kind of law do you do?" "Oh, I do securities law. I work in the financial services industry." Okay, maybe they'd ask me if I knew about the Bernie Madoff case or something like that. But then I'd say, "But I'm also doing a lot of work in the cannabis industry." I now had an audience for 3 hours. They were fascinated by it. They were, and then the other part of it that was great is you learn what people's consumption habits were that you never believed. The kid's coach is talking about, "Oh, I was in Colorado and I got my hands on this. Have you seen this stuff?" But and so from having access to legal, access to accounting, access to banking, I think we are a lot further along than I believed we were, especially given that we haven't really seen any significant changes at the federal level. We haven't seen amendments to the banking, the BSA. We haven't seen amendments to, model rules of professional responsibility for the lawyers or for accountants. And so I think that those ancillary service providers have evolved pretty nicely. I mean, there was a day where I would ask, do you have a bank account? Part of my due diligence was, do you have a bank account? I don't ask that question anymore because I know that, everybody has bank accounts. Everybody has access to banking. Yeah, they're still cash heavy, but, I only have a couple of clients that, offer to pay me in cash. Everybody else, it's all right, I'll send you a check. I'll wire your funds. So in that context, I think we're further along than I expected.
What was the most cash you've ever seen in a room?
It was probably So there was an operator, there was a grower in San Francisco who I only remember this, right? He shared a wall with an adult film studio. And I thought,
Okay.
this is just, I felt like I was living the Narcos show in real life. I believe they said they had 10 million in cash and about 450 pounds of flour sitting in bags in 2 rooms. And I remember, and the only reason I remember that is I went home, I went back to my hotel, had a cocktail. I was watching Narcos at the time, and I got to the scene at the very end where Pablo Escobar gets shot. He's alone and he gets shot up. And I remember calling my wife and saying, "If I get shot up, I love you." And she's like, "What are you talking about? Where are you?" For some reason, in my mind, I was living that Narcos lifestyle. Totally, obviously false. Totally different world. But yeah, it was about $10 million and several hundred pounds of flour in one room.
Talking about the regulatory side of things, you had mentioned that it seems like we have this track record of taking the bad and making it worse. Do you have some specific examples?
Number one is social equity. I will continue to this day say we are ruining social equity. Social equity in theory is a great idea. The concept of let's take people that have been impacted by the war on marijuana, the war on drugs. Let's take people that their families have been impacted, and let's give them an opportunity to get out of the rut. Let's give them an opportunity to grow. The problem with that is we focus on, and this is my opinion, we focus so much on ownership. So how are we going to deal with social equity? How are we going to help these people? We're going to give them a license. We're going to help them get a license. Well, okay, now that the dog's got the bumper, what is he going to do with it? That's kind of the way I look at it. And unfortunately, a lot of these people have never run a business. They wouldn't know where to start running a business. They've never had access to capital. They've never had access to money. They've never seen the revenues that are coming in if they're able to get to that step. And so, unfortunately, we give people dreams, we give people hopes, we give people, an opportunity that they really can't execute on through this ownership. And yes, it does look good that we give, if you got 3,000 applicants and 100 of them get a license, that's great. But what about the other 2,900 people? And the state that, in my opinion, tried to get it right, but unfortunately did it wrong, was Illinois. And not many people will praise Illinois' cannabis industry, but they had a social equity component that was, okay, if a majority of the owners are from an impoverished part of town or fit within the category of impacted by the war on drugs or minorities, you qualify as social equity. But you can also qualify based on the number of social equity candidates you employ. And so you could employ, I think it was more than 50% of your staff had to be social equity, and you could have no connection to social equity as an owner and still qualify. The way Illinois flawed was you had to hire them and start paying them before you applied, and nobody could afford that. But that to me is how we really fix the solution is we focus on employment, training, and advancement of social equity candidates, not giving them a license. And what I mean by that is let's take me. I'm a middle-aged white guy in Minnesota. Do very well for myself. I'm not social equity by any means. What if I went out and I hired a staff of 75% social equity candidates and I trained them and I educated them and I promoted them up to management positions, whether it's an assistant manager of cultivation, whether it's, the head of buying for seeds and clones, whether it's managing a retail shop, you name it, whatever it is. I start them at the bottom level because they probably don't have the experience, and I promote them up and I train them and I educate them. What have I done in 3 to 5 years? I've given them a set of tools that they can either go out and they can start their own cannabis business and succeed because now they know how to do it, or they can go do something else. If they're retail, they could go run a clothing store. They could go run a gas station. If they're in manufacturing, they can go manufacture something other than cannabis products. Cultivation, they can grow tomatoes, they can grow corn, they can do all kinds of other things. And now we've given them a skill set and we've given them an opportunity to succeed long-term versus maybe making a quick buck. The problem is, and I truly believe this is social equity is a political ploy. It's a political tool. And politicians can turn around and say, see, social equity worked. We gave 100 people a license in 6 months. We never do the follow-up on where are those licenses in 3 years. if we did the follow-up in 3 years and we did what I'm talking about, I think we'd succeed. And so, social equity is to me the most important, one of the most important aspects of this industry and one of the biggest failures nationwide.
So in that scenario, would social equity be more in the form of grants and state tax incentives for operators that go that route?
Absolutely. You definitely do that. I think that's a great way to do it. Giving people access to capital. I'm living this day in, day out right now in Minnesota. We opened up our social equity applications. We did a very strange approach to our applications. Instead of the most qualified, it's the luckiest of those who can pass the bare minimum. And so I've had people come to me and they've said, I'm going to apply for a mezzo license, which is, 3 retail, I think it's 5,000 square feet of cultivation, 5,000 square feet of manufacturing. And they've said, once I get my license, I'm going to have to raise capital. And I'm explaining to them that, look, the fact that you got your license because you had a prior felony conviction only helps in getting the license. It doesn't help in getting the banking account. It doesn't help in raising capital. It doesn't help in all of these other aspects. And I'm going to get a grant from the state of Minnesota for $150,000. Anybody in this audience can tell you $150,000 is getting you nowhere in the industry. Maybe you can make some progress on a contractor for a retail shop, but that's about it. And so let's find ways to get them access to the capital that they need. Let's find ways to give, tax breaks. Let's find ways to promote employing these people, training these people, educating these people, as opposed to saying, congratulations, social equity person, here's your license, good luck, because that's really all we're doing right now.
So social equity is number one. When it comes to bad policies, state to state, what are numbers 2 and 3 that could use some improvement?
Number 2 to me is arrogance at the regulatory level. We're all new to this industry. We're all learning this as we go. Rules change all the time. Laws change all the time. In cannabis, they change even more because what looked good when it was, put on a voter initiative or what looked good at the state level, once you put it into practice, doesn't seem to work. And so you have to evolve it. The problem is, regulators in cannabis, in my experience, and I deal with them almost every day, they look at the operators as the enemy. They don't look at them as their killer. And unfortunately, operators look at the regulators as the enemy. They don't look at it as their partner. And so it's a constant battle. It's a constant fight. It's, I don't want to contact the regulator and ask them for my opinion. And then the regulators at the same time saying, you shouldn't be contacting me about this. And we're just here to regulate. We're just here to enforce the rules, not to teach you how to, to operate within those rules. And so, unfortunately, what you find is nobody wants to say, I don't know the answer. Nobody wants to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Instead, it's, I'm going to just take this to the grave and I'm going to fight. And what you end up having is you have good operators who lose a ton. They lose their licenses. They lose, a part of their business because the regulator, wants to draw a line in the sand instead of saying, let's get you cleaned up. Let's get you fixed. Let's impose an appropriate sanction penalty, but let's really get you going the right direction. Instead, we just want punish, and we won't acknowledge where we were wrong on some of these things. And then, flip it around. You got really good regulators that, feel, and from conversations I've had with some of them, feel that that's their job. They're the police. And what you need is this partnership. You need this cohesion between the two of them so that, when we learn stuff on the operational side, we can report that to the regulators and the regulators can take it and do what they need to do with it, whether it's amending the rules, whether it's amending how they enforce the rules, and then vice versa. Regulators can come in and say, we're making these changes because we don't think this worked. Do you think this is an alternative that works? And I'll give a great example. I do a lot of work in the state of Montana. The state of Montana has this really goofy labeling system where you get a template. You have to get all of your labels approved. That's not goofy. That's normal. But it's a template. It has like half the information on it before you get it approved. So you submit it, you get it approved, and then you plug all the information in and you put it on. And you don't do it product by product. So if I've got 7 different strains, I don't submit 7 labels. I submit a flower label. But the flower could be different. It could be, different strains, different, you name it, different volumes. And so it's like, let's work together on figuring out what makes the most sense on how we actually submit our labels to you, the state, for approval, and how you approve them and what content needs to be on them, instead of nope, you submitted you submitted it, but that was incorrect because you added all this other stuff. And it's a goofy system. And what really kind of summed up, going back to what I was saying about let's admit we're wrong, is I want to say it was about February of this year, the Cannabis Control Division in Montana changed all its labeling requirements. And I only know this because I worked with one operator to get almost 1,000 labels approved. We were overly cautious because they had a PDA, a proposed department action that was pending. And so we submitted all of them, got them approved. And then 3 months later, the state comes in and says your labels are inaccurate. Well, that's because they changed the label. But guess what? They didn't change the template on the website for 6 months. So we were compliant with what was supposed to be on the website, but not compliant with the rule that they had changed. And oh, by the way, the non-compliance was we had more information on the label than they wanted. So we actually put the name and license of the cultivator on the product, when now all of a sudden we don't need it. So it's, again, from a regulatory perspective, number two is let's just work together. Let's be partners on this, and let's make this industry work. Let's stop fighting.
Were the regulators in that specific situation reasonable? Did they listen to, your argument and kind of understand where you were coming from, or did it remain combative?
Still combative as we sit here today. It's in fact, it's gotten worse. And it's not just this one operator. I know several of them that in Montana in particular have had similar issues. They just, I don't know what it is. I don't know why it is, but for whatever reason, it's you've got 12 stores across the state and you've got 6 products that have the wrong label. Okay, well, let's be honest. That's probably really one violation, a label violation. But no, they're going to call it, 65 violations, and then they're going to go, look at the number of violations. We got to shut you down. We got to punish you. So, no, unfortunately, that's an instance that didn't get better. And again, it should be a learning scenario here. I mean, this is a new industry. I mean, if you go look at any other industry, look at pharmaceuticals, look at the auto industry. It's been around forever and things are still changing. This is new. This is, we're what, 20, almost 30 years. If you go back to California's medical, 96, we're babies. So let's all work together and advance this versus fighting.
Is that where that hostility stems from? Because we're still so close to it being completely illegal?
I don't think that's necessarily it. I think that, well, let me back up. There's some component to that. I think that people on the regulatory side assume that because this came out of an illegal market, people must still be operating illegally. And yes, that does exist. I mean, I've filed, reports with regulators all the time, of people that, are falsifying COAs, for example. They're buying in Minnesota, I've seen this. They're buying marijuana edibles from Colorado, shipping them in here, and then they're falsifying the COA so it looks like it's a hemp-derived product when it really isn't. And so, yes, some of that is there. Some of that is, I think, driving that. I think, but I think that's just part of it. I think that there's a lot of regulators that if you ask them, they would like to be licensees. I think that they think that they got the raw end of the stick there, and there's some jealousy that's going on. I can run this business better than you, but you just got this because, you're a convicted felon. And if I would have been a convicted felon, I'd have it. Or if I was, fit into this box here, I'd have a license. So I think there's some jealousy there as well. You also get in some states where, the voters might have voted to approve and legalize, but, the government may not necessarily agree with it. There may be directives coming from higher up. I'm sure if you ask the governor of Montana right now, he'd probably say, I don't want cannabis in my state, but the voters approved it. Or, look at South Dakota. The voters want marijuana in South Dakota, but, we got a governor that wants nothing to do with it there. So I think there's a lot of driving forces.
You had mentioned hemp-derived products. What is your take on that side of the business? Do you think hemp businesses are going to survive once rescheduling and descheduling occurs? And what's the state of Delta 8?
I think Delta 8 needs to go. I we in Minnesota were kind of at the forefront of this. We had, I've been attacked by people for saying this, but we had what I would describe as an intentionally bad law that was written, not our current cannabis law, but our hemp-derived law before that. It was thrown together very quickly. I think that the folks on the left side of the aisle knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew that if this bill got passed and this law was put into place, it's so bad that the only way to resolve it is to legalize, which is what we did. I think that the folks on the right were naive and didn't understand what they were signing, and they just heard hemp and they knew Farm Bill and they thought we're fine. But it's everywhere. I mean, it's absolutely everywhere, the hemp derived products. And Delta 8 it's hard to control, it's dangerous. I've had very, very regular cannabis consumers try Delta 8 products and just had horrendous experiences with it. So, I think that the hemp derived synthetics, the Delta 8s, Delta 10s, HHC products, those types of things, I think they need to go. I think they are going to go eventually. I don't think we're going to see them. I think the hemp derived Delta 9 products will eventually be regulated and only sold in dispensaries, much like marijuana products. I think that's probably where we're going. And honestly, I've got no problem with that. I mean, I've got one of my sons, I got 16-year-old twin boys. 2 years ago when he was 14 years old, he said to me, "Hey, Dad," and they know what I do. They've heard me talk with people. He said, "Dad, do you know I can buy marijuana gummies or I can consume marijuana gummies legally?" And I said, "No, you can't. You're 14 years old." He said, "Yeah, those those hemp products that you can buy at the gas station, I can't buy them, but I can have them and consume them." And I said, "No, you can't." And I looked at the bill. Sure enough, the way the law was written, 21 and up to buy, but not 21 and up to possess or consume. He was 100% correct. And so, that's a rare scenario where legally he would have been allowed to do it, but it's everywhere. I mean, I can go to the grocery stores, I can go to the gas stations, I can go anywhere and buy a product that is not regulated and is very competitive with, cannabis products that are absolutely regulated. So I do think we're going to see a lot of changes there. I think that, like I said, I firmly believe, and I think we're going to see the D8s and D10 products and those synthetics go away. I think we're going to have to really work on what is a synthetic. I've had regulators tell me that, anything with THC in it is synthetic. I don't agree with that. I think that, hemp-derived products, hemp-derived Delta 9 products will probably survive, but that's about it.
When do you see that change coming?
Well, there was a bill, I think that was proposed like 2 days ago at the federal level that discussed it. I actually had a company that we're doing some work for asking me about that. It probably, I mean, we got enough going on politically right now that probably not going to be anytime soon. But I think regardless of who wins the next election, I think we're going to see significant changes in the next 4 years. And at the end of the day, I think both of these candidates are kind of on the same page when it comes to cannabis. I mean, we're just at a point now where, even the old people, for lack of better terms, the grandmas and grandpas that are, Reaganers and, the war on drugs, they've even accepted it. They understand what it is. I lived it with my mother. My mother was died almost 6 years ago of stage 4 colon cancer. And she spent 6 years down in Rochester, Mayo, getting plugged with chemo. And, she would constantly tell me, "Oh, honey, I'm not going to do drugs. I grew up daughter of a banker in northern Minnesota." And, and I'm trying to explain to her that the stuff going in your system is a worse drug than what I'm talking about. And it wasn't until I actually laced her breakfast with Marinol, and she mistakenly thought it was the love of her son that gave her the energy. But when I explained it to her what it was, she even came on board. It's like, all right. And next thing you know, it's Thanksgiving dinner and she's running down to have a couple of puffs on her vape pen before she eats because she's feeling better. So, it's the stigma I don't think is there anymore. I don't think the resistance to it is there. It's not we don't want it at all. I think it's more of a, how do we get there? And I think, in the next 4 years, we're going to see significant changes at the federal level.
Why have you been attacked for your opinions on the hemp-derived side of the business?
I've been attacked because, and this is a Minnesota thing, and attack's probably not the best way to use it, but definitely have opposition. I generally stay pretty humble. I stay pretty quiet. I stay kind of in the shadows. I have seen too many people in my home state get horrendous advice from others who are purporting to be an expert. They're jumping on the train. They're riding a quick buck. They were crypto consultants up till 2 years ago. And I'm sure in 2 years they're going to be psychedelic consultants is the next thing they're going to be. And I'm seeing people literally watching them ruin their lives. I'm watching people cash out their 401ks. I'm watching people, quit their jobs and sell their houses, take out all the equity out of their house, get into this space. And how do they try to get into this space? Well, they start in the hemp derived, because in Minnesota, you just register with the agency and you're good to go. And we can get brand recognition that way. You can start to get brand recognition. And they're throwing everything away for no pun intended, a pipe dream. A pipe dream that 3,000 people are applying for 100 spots or whatever the number is. And then even if you get that, you don't have access to the capital, and they're telling you, it's easy to raise money. That's simple. And they don't understand the first thing of operations. They don't understand you tell them what metric is, and they tell you you're spelling it wrong. It's, you're missing the I. And they don't understand the seed to sale tracking. They don't understand just kind of basic components, and they're destined to fail. And yeah, we might get one or two people that succeed, but all these other people are going to throw in everything they've got and end up with nothing. And so as I'm starting to hear the purported experts and leaders in Minnesota give advice, and I'm having clients come to me directly with this advice, I started pushing back. And I started reaching out to people and saying, you've got somebody like me who's lived this, who's experienced this. I've been in almost every single state, border to border, coast to coast. I've dealt with regulators, whether it's the MED, the OMMA, Cannabis Control Division of Montana. I mean, I could go on and on. I've defended proposed department actions. I've conducted inspections. I've written, compliance procedures and those types of things. Listen to me. Let me give you advice, state, on how to do this. But, I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not going to throw a bunch of money at the government. And as a result of that, they've decided to listen to the wrong people. And as a result of that, we've had an absolute disaster here in Minnesota. We hired a director who was here for one day because, for a variety of different reasons, was driven out. I mean, she was selling illegal products online when she was announced as the leader. We've decided to issue licenses before we have rules. How we do that, I don't understand. And so the more I push back on that, and specifically talking about, things like branding and the difference between hemp products and cannabis products, and, the way you regulate or the way you're compliant with a hemp, 2-page statute versus 300 pages of rules and regulations, are night and day difference. The people that are giving the advice, the opposite advice, they're pushing back on me, and they're pushing back on several of us. There's probably half dozen of us in Minnesota that have actually worked in the space more than 2 years and more than the hemp industry. And so that's where I'm really starting to see the pushback. And so I'm starting to become a little more vocal, and, it's unfortunate, but at the same time rewarding when somebody says to me, well, everybody else I talked to is saying something different than what you said, Chris. And then 6 months later, they come back and they say, yep, you were right. They were wrong. Our bad. Can you take us back? So.
But besides all that in Minnesota, things are fine, right?
No, no, they're not. We've got a lot of problems here. So, we're supposed to have this lottery for licensees. I firmly believe that the vast majority of the people to get a license will fail. The way it's set up here in Minnesota is you get, let's just call it your temporary license. And then you've got 3-year window, or actually, 18-month window to get fully up and running. You don't have to have real estate lined up to apply in Minnesota. So in an 18-month window, somehow you're going to find the real estate, find the financing for the real estate, for the equipment, for the products, for everything else, build out your facilities, build out your compliance program, and get up and running. That's just not going to happen. You talk to the MSOs, they're going to tell you that's not possible. That's not even possible for an MSO, let alone for somebody who's never been in the space. Then you add to it, we got our first draft of rules and regulations. They came out right when we were finishing up the application window. They were horrendous. They needed all kinds of work. We're now probably not going to have the rules and regulations in place before people get their temporary licenses. There are certain advisors that are telling people raising capital is a cakewalk. I can tell you right now, it's not. And I'm not just talking about cannabis. I'm talking about any industry. The way the market is and the way the economy is right now, it's hard to raise capital. And then you got people that are working out loopholes. We're allowed to grow for homegrown in Minnesota. You can have, you can have 4 plants four plants flowering at one time. You can also sell hemp-derived products at any store, gas station, grocery store, anywhere. The number of times I've had people tell me, well, what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a special. I'm going to sell hemp-derived products at my store. And if you come in and you buy $200 worth of hemp-derived product, I'll give you a quarter of an ounce of flower that I grew at home. Well, that's not legal. That's not allowed. And then you've got, going back to this partnership issue, the tribes have been able to get ahead of everybody else here in Minnesota, and they've started to open up. Well, you've got people that, they're upset about that. They're angry about that. Personally, I got no problem with it. I think that tribal cannabis is a great thing and it's a great opportunity, but it's created this conflict, I think, between potential operators. Then you've got the non-social equity and the social equity people. So I honestly, it's sad to say this, but I think we are currently in Minnesota on the path to a reset. I think in 3 years, we're going to have to do a reset of some sort, because we're just, so focused on getting product on the shelves right away. We're not thinking about, is it good product? Is it quality product? Is it the right people that are growing it? Do they know how to grow it? We're going the wrong direction.
What does that reset look like? And is this something that can happen, I guess, not incrementally, but in stages, if people recognize the error of their ways? Or is it just the bubble's going to burst and we're going to have to start from zero again?
I don't think we're going to have to start from zero. Don't take me wrong. We're going to have people that are going to succeed, but it's, right now, the first group of licensees in Minnesota are only social equity. We're going to have a lot of what I call the rent to social equity applicants, which is the MSOs come in. Phoenix is a great example. There were 10 licenses available, and there were groups that were out there giving people $1,000 and 2 ounces of flower if they sign up to be a partner. And they're, the MSOs basically owning everything. They got all the rights. Now we're trying to eliminate that in Minnesota, but any of us good lawyers could figure out ways around a lot of that. And I've heard some pretty creative things that, as we sit here today, are compliant. So I think what we're going to end up having is we're going to have a handful of operators that will succeed, social equity operators. But then I think the reset's going to be, we got to stop focusing on giving everybody a chance. We got to go to the more traditional model, which is prove that you can do this the right way to get your license, not prove you can do the bare minimum and get lucky. Prove that you have access to the right amount of capital, so we're not wasting time. The other thing that we're doing in Minnesota, which is goofy, is, we give out a retail license for every 12,500 people. You don't have to put you don't have to have real estate to apply. We might end up having every social equity license in the city of Minneapolis. So now we got to do a bit of a reset there, because how are we going to hit up Duluth and St. Cloud and Mankato and some of these other markets that absolutely have sufficient population? And so, I don't think it's going to be a complete reset. I don't think it's going to be, let's wipe the industry out and start all over. But I think the way in which we take applications, the way in which we scale or grade applications, the way in which we issue licenses, I think that's going to change drastically. And we are going to go from this, we're trying to give everybody an opportunity, to that really didn't work. Lots of people's livelihoods got ruined. Lots of people cashed out every penny they had only to get nothing. Now let's start focusing on, the people that can succeed, and let's get them the licenses.
What are some of those creative things that good lawyers like yourself can do and are doing to be compliant?
So the one that I'm hearing a lot here in Minnesota is, because of the way our social equity rule is written, 35, you can only have 35% of the ownership of a company be non-social equity. Well, if I'm going to build out a 5,000 square foot canopy grow, I'm going to build out a manufacturing with that similar size and 3 retails, I'm going to raise a lot of money. It's just ballpark, let's say $10 million. I don't think anybody's going to give $10 million for 35% of the company, especially when not only 35% of the economics, but 35% of the vote and no control. And so what I'm hearing people say is, okay, well, maybe I've got all the experience, I've got all the knowledge, and I've got money, so I'm going to become an employee as well. And so now I can have an employment contract in addition to that, or alternative ways of financing the real estate independent of financing the business. Equipment financing, another great way to do it. Have somebody, I can go out and I can buy the lights, I can buy the manufacturing equipment, I can buy the extraction equipment, and I can finance it for you. I'm not eating into your equity, so we're not running into that issue. We're going to do this in a fair, competitive way. So there's a lot of ways to do that. The one that I've heard a lot of that I don't advise, and I think it's a loophole, it's going to get closed up, is the 35%. I should say not 35%. The way the statute's written, you can only have certain types of licenses with other licenses. So for example, I always say you're kind of customer facing or you're on the back end of it. So you can cultivate and manufacture, but you can't have retail unless it's a micro or meso. You can have retail and maybe some of the deliveries and events, but you can't on the other side have cultivation manufacturing. That technically only applies to the management, the general partner, not the passive investor. And so what I'm hearing a lot of people say is, well, I'm going to put a bunch of money into a bunch of different businesses and I'm just not going to be the manager. I'm just not going to be the general partner. And that's how I'm going to get around that. That's going to get closed up. That's a loophole that's going to die. The other thing you're seeing is I'm hearing about these co-op type of situations where it's, well, you get your manufacturing, you get your grow. We're not going to be together on paper, but we're kind of still together through the way we do our purchase agreements and those types of things. That's another thing that's going to end up getting defeated. But the problem is there's a lot of creativity, but we don't know what works or doesn't work because we don't have the rules yet. We don't have the regulations yet. So we're a little bit putting the cart in front of the horse here. There are some things that you definitely can do, and some things that you can definitely work out. And the financing mechanism is, I think, a big one.
You had mentioned how much bad information there is out in the industry and how many, it seems like, the fight's getting even more difficult for yourself. You said it yourself, you're only one man. What are you doing to try and get more quality information out there to operators, outside of cloning yourself? I mean, are you growing a staff, or how can you help turn the tide there?
So I'm partnering with the right people. And if it's okay, I can even mention their names on this podcast if that works for you.
Oh, absolutely.
So Angela Lesperance at Miss Jane Accounting. She is one of the premier small business cannabis accounting firms. She's based here in Minnesota. I work with her almost all the time. Bridge West is another great accounting firm. They do really good work for the bigger players. Mitch Chargo over at Hinshaw Culbertson. It's funny because when we met, he was general counsel for one of our two medical operators. I was outside counsel. We've kind of flipped now. He's on the outside looking in, and I'm really more on the inside. But we work quite a bit together on stuff. And so really just making sure that, one, there's enough people out there that I can refer people to, because at the end of the day, I'm not practicing law in the cannabis space. I'm consulting on compliance. So you need somebody who understands the industry from a legal, somebody who understands it from an accounting and bookkeeping perspective. So really making sure I've got the right team around me, and then just educating, whether it's through this. I speak at continuing legal education seminars all the time to talk to lawyers. I speak at, National Business Institute quite a bit. Really, this podcast and other opportunities like this, just educating people that, hey, ask people what they've done, what their experience is. In Minnesota in particular, if their experience has been only in Minnesota, they've never worked in the cannabis industry. I don't care what they say. They've worked in the hemp industry, which is very limited. And so, just educating people, getting out there. I'd probably say 60% of the time I'm told I don't know what I'm talking about because somebody else is an expert. And okay, fine. You can go that way. I know what's going to happen. You're going to come back. But it's really just out there, just getting the right team and educating. But from a staff perspective, no, it's me. My family works for me. They help me out with stuff, but that's about it.
Talking about some of the compliance issues in the industry, I find myself constantly surprised that as a whole, this industry sometimes pushes back when it comes to compliance, more so than traditional manufacturing, which I've covered most of my life. Where do you think that stems from? And just because to me, I can't see any scenario where that is a successful long-term play.
Compliance is a four-letter word in the industry. And if you ask people who their compliance department is, it's usually a combination of their lawyer, their accountant, and the principals of the company. I jokingly say it's kind of like asking a team with two quarterbacks who their quarterback is. If you have two quarterbacks, you have no quarterbacks. If you don't have a true compliance person, you don't have any compliance person, in my opinion. And so, that people need to get compliance as part of their dialogue, part of their regular conversation. Compliance is king in the space. If somebody's going to buy you out, they're going to look at whether or not you're a compliant business. If a bank's going to give you an account or financing, they're going to look to make sure you're compliant. If you're not compliant, you're not going to get access to banking. You're not going to get access to financing. A sophisticated investor is going to use that as a way to, negotiate down the purchase price on an investment or buying a business. So one, you need to make it part of the daily dialogue. Two, you need to understand, you need to have somebody that's their focus. Now, it could be somebody on the outside like me that, spends 10, 12 hours a month working with you on compliance issues. It could be a designated principal within the company. But you need to have somebody that compliance isn't just a title, it's something that they do. And then they got to understand how to do it. And it's not complex. It's, testing, it's developing a compliance program, testing that compliance program, and implementing that compliance program. And those are concepts that come out of the financial services industry. Develop, test, and implement. So let's write our compliance procedures. Let's stay on top of the rules and regs and update them as we need. Let's test them. So let's test for mistakes. Things like, what do you do when metric goes down? What do you do when you lose power? How do you do that? I always tell people, take a notepad, bare minimum, write down your sales that way, and then plug it in later. But notify the regulator of the mistake. Get ahead of it. Don't ask for excuses. And then implement it. You train. You continue to train. You constantly train. You have somebody like me come in and do surprise purchases to see if maybe something goes south. You have me do random reviews of your product or your labels. I always tell people, if you have an inspection coming up with the regulators, have me or somebody like me come out a week before and do a mock inspection. And I can tell you where all the mistakes are, and then you can fix them before the real inspection comes. It's no different than practicing for a test or practicing for a game. I got football players. They practice plays going into the game. Let's do the exact same thing here. But you really have to make sure compliance is part of the regular dialogue. It's not a scary thing. It's not, super expensive. It's not super challenging, but it will kill you if you don't do it the right way.
Do you do a fair amount of secret shopping?
Secret shopping, yes and no. So I don't go in and look for, go to a random operator and look and see, oh, hey, there's somebody I have no connection to and they made a mistake. If I'm in shopping at a dispensary, and I'm traveling or something like that, and I see something, I will tell people, like, you might want to change this. But for my clients, I have gone in and I've been asked to go in oftentimes of, can you go to this store because we're getting reports of this store not checking IDs? Can you go in and ask? And so I'll go in and, hey, how you doing? And hey, I need to buy this. Do you have an ID? Oh, I left my wallet back at the hotel. I don't have it. Come on, look at me. I'm 21. You know that. I'm not buying medical. You don't need to track it for purchasing limits. And then, what typically happens is the good operators and the good people will say, nope, sorry, can't sell to you. Okay, congratulations, you did it right. The ones that, occasionally will not do it, I'll just come right back in and we'll have a conversation and get things fixed and get training done. So, I will do that. That usually comes up in one of two contexts. When we have a scheduled inspection, I'll do a pre-inspection. Or if we know that the regulators are watching you closely, I'll come in and I'll keep an eye on things. And sometimes that just comes out of deficiency notices and those types of things.
You mentioned that you were inspired or encouraged about cultivating on tribal lands. Is that specific to Minnesota, or is that something that you've seen throughout the U.S. and it's had moderate success?
Throughout the U.S., actually. There are a couple of tribes that are doing a phenomenal job. The Flandreau Sioux tribe in South Dakota is one that I would point to. They're doing great things. There's a woman out of Idaho, Mary Jane Oatman, who's a huge advocate for the cannabis industry and tribal cannabis industry. I think she's the president of the National Indigenous Cannabis Association. She's doing phenomenal things. We're seeing a lot of it in Minnesota, but we're seeing it, in tribes around the country. They're starting to open up a little bit more. They're starting to realize that, hey, we don't have the same fears that we had hundreds of years ago about the federal government coming in and stealing everything from us and taking everything from us. They're a little bit more powerful when it comes to sovereign immunity and pushing back on that. The one area that I see that they're still very nervous about cannabis is the tribes that are very involved in gaming. They don't want to risk, a phenomenal amount of money that they're making in the gaming industry with the cannabis issue. But beyond that, some of these smaller tribes and even some of these bigger tribes. I mean, I've talked to folks in the Crow Agency out in Montana about opportunities that maybe you can get a license, a state license, and then you can supply on the reservation to tribal people. You're giving people a job opportunity. You're giving people access to something that's different than what's creating a lot of the drug problems on these reservations. You're giving them a skill set. Yeah, you can do a lot of great things, and it's not just in Minnesota. It's in fact most of my experience with tribal cannabis is outside of Minnesota.
So, is the deal that they can grow, they can cultivate and sell, but it has to be limited to tribal members?
So I'm not a tribal law expert, so I typically would bring tribal law experts in on this, but generally, there's different attitudes. It depends on this. If the tribe is big enough, they will, they will go ahead and they will just sell just to tribal members, and they can decide, do we want to be medical only or adult use only? But I do know of tribes that are going, there's land, tribal land reservation, just outside of the Hamptons, for example. And I know of one tribe in particular that has opened up a dispensary there. They've partnered up. They're not in New York, but they've partnered up with a local tribe, and they've gone ahead and here's how we're going to grow. Here's how we're going to manufacture. Here's how we're going to sell. And they're not just selling to tribal people. They're hitting everybody in the Hamptons right now. And they're doing unbelievable things. So, it really depends on the risk tolerance and how far the tribes are willing to go. Some are, I've heard stories of some that are willing to experiment, or at least thinking of experimenting with tribal transportation. That if I grow on this reservation in Minnesota, and I ship it using tribal transportation to this reservation down in Florida, that's intertribal commerce. That is not something the federal government can stop. Now, I haven't seen it happen yet, but I've heard of tribes that are contemplating it. So I think we're going to see that continue to expand as well.
No, that's a really interesting point. Just I'm familiar with some smaller tribes in the Wisconsin area as well. And you're right that it's been hard for traditional industry to catch on in those smaller communities. But, cannabis is something that's relatively scalable and could be a good fit for those communities.
Absolutely. And they're afraid. They're afraid that they don't want to be, it's like the banks. Every big national bank will tell you they don't touch cannabis, but they all do. They just don't want to be the first one that the feds knock on the door and look at them for $100 million penalty. Just like the tribes don't want to be the first one that has that happen. But there are certain tribes out there that have been more progressive, been more aggressive, that have been leaders, and they're doing a good job of working with some of these other tribal leaders and explaining to them that, look, this is how you do it. This is, we can partner up if you want. We can work together. You can sell, all grow and manufacture. And so, that tribal cannabis industry is growing exponentially. And it really is the work of, some phenomenal leaders like Mary Jane Oatman, who I mentioned earlier. She is the queen of tribal cannabis. And if anybody ever wants to get into that industry or has questions, she is the leader, and she's done phenomenal things for the Native American community.
2 years ago, you split out on your own. What made you finally take the leap?
It was a combination of things. So yeah, and actually, to be clear, it was a year ago. A year ago on October 1st.
Okay.
I was in private practice for 20 years. And one Boustead was a long-term client of mine. I had done a lot of work for them for a long time. They were at a point where they needed general counsel inside. A lot of my work was litigation. I got tired of fighting other people's fights. To be brutally honest, I'm not a big fan of lawyers, even though I am a lawyer, even though I come from a family of lawyers. And I realized that it didn't matter. It didn't matter what firm, it didn't matter where they're located. Lawyers are lawyers are lawyers, and firms are firms are firms. And I just generally didn't see the same way. I'm one of those, go find the work, do the work, build the work, get paid for the work. And I realized that, you had people that wanted to find it, but didn't want to do it and whatnot. And so it was a good time for me to leave private practice. It was a good time for Boustead to bring somebody on board. We ended up being a great fit. To be honest, I don't think I'll ever go back to private practice. But then what happened with the Cannapliant Consulting was, because of all the work I'd done in the cannabis industry for 10 years, I didn't want to just abandon that entire industry and abandon that practice. At the same time, we at Bousted, we do, we're a small investment bank. Well, let me back up. We're an international investment banking firm, but we work on small cap clients, emerging markets. Small cap IPOs are our real bread and butter. And because of that, we've done some work with the cannabis industry, whether it's, hemp derived products that we can help take public, or it's marijuana companies, but they're in other countries where it's 100% federally legal, so they could have access to the U.S. markets. And so because of that, the leadership team at Bousted decided it made sense for me to stay involved in the cannabis industry. And so that's where we came up with the idea of Cannapliant Consulting, which was, Chris, why don't you form Cannapliant Consulting? You can continue to work in the industry through that. That'll be, kind of your securities industry calls an outside business activity, although I'm not registered, so technically that's not what it is. And so you can continue to do that. And then we can also use that expertise, and you can stay on top of things here at the investment banking firm. And so that's really how it evolved. And it was pretty easy because I realized 99% of what I was doing for clients anyways was clients consulting anyways. And so I looked at it and said, I don't have to pay your hourly rate as a lawyer. I can pay you half the price, if not more. And absolutely, it's a no-brainer. And so now like I said, I help them find solutions moving forward and being a compliant business.
Being in a family full of lawyers, are you the black sheep, or are you the person out on the leading edge of the new frontier?
Well, I'm probably the black sheep for other reasons, but for personal reasons. But no, I'm definitely at the fore. I'm on the frontier. When I say family of lawyers, it's the generation before me. So it's fathers, uncles, stepmothers, that type of situation. They're traditional, HR lawyers, employment lawyers, trial lawyers. I jokingly tell people asbestos is what put me through law school and put me through college, because my father was a asbestos defense lawyer. So I'm probably at the forefront in that context. It's been very interesting. The hardest dynamic for me is trying to figure out how to navigate with my children what I do. Having 16 and 14-year-old kids. The funny story about that was when they were probably I think my boys were freshmen in high school. They had to do a research project, and they both picked legalization of marijuana. And of course, they weren't the only ones that picked that. And so as part of the research, my name started popping up and articles I'd written. And so all of a sudden, a bunch of freshmen in high school saw that their father was in some way, shape, or form involved in the marijuana industry. And they had it in their minds that my son's dad was almost like a cartel guy. I don't think they quite realized what I did, which was compliance and legal. They just heard the industry. And so all of a sudden, they became very, very popular among their friends, because their friends all assumed I was, growing and selling and manufacturing, as opposed to what I was really doing. But that's really been the hardest challenge in the space is navigating that with my children. We're very open, very upfront with what I do. 10 years ago, it was probably a much more difficult discussion. The industry has become a lot more mainstream these days. And so it's a lot easier of a conversation with their friends, with their friends' parents, and others. So, yeah.
Well, Chris, I really do appreciate you being generous with your time. Before we get out of here, I just wanted to ask, is there anything else that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience either knows about yourself or your work at Cannapliant Consulting?
Compliance isn't just plant touching. If you're manufacturing equipment that you are marketing and know is going to be used in the industry, you arguably are violating the federal drug paraphernalia laws. And so you need to make sure that you are also compliant. Compliance can be what you do internally, but compliance can also be who you're working with. And so don't assume that just because you're not plant touching, that you somehow are special, or that somehow you don't have to think of all the same concepts that we're talking about today and the concepts that we're working on a daily basis. Yeah, you don't have to think about seed to sale tracking, those types of things, but you do need to think about how you market your equipment, how who you sell it to, making sure that everything's airtight in that context. And so, I always tell people, and this isn't just equipment manufacturing, this is anybody ancillary to the industry. compliance is as important to you as it is to the plant touching people. So make sure that you've got, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's an accountant, whether it's a compliance consultant, make sure you've got the right team in place to protect you.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate you sharing your expertise, and I really hope we get a chance to do it again soon, because I feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we'll probably, if my expectation is correct, we probably got a lot to talk about in 6 months in Minnesota, because we should have the lottery should be done, and we should start to see what those licenses look like. And hopefully I'm wrong, and we're having a conversation about why I'm wrong. But definitely there's a conversation, and yeah, I'd love to keep this dialogue going.
Well, either way, I'm looking forward to it. But before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. All right, for Chris Parrington, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we will see you next week.
Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.